Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the GCSC's keynote lecture series, the first iteration of this semester. My name, as all of you here, I guess, know, but I'm still repeating it for those who are joining us online, is Michael Basseler. I'm academic manager at the GCSC, and I'm standing here tonight in lieu of Dr. Jens Kugle, our head of research coordination, who is joining us online, one of the people joining online, since he's currently, as many of you know, not here at the GCSC, not even in Germany. He's joining us from the US, from Washington, DC. So, and we briefly talked before the event, and he asked me to do just a little bit of a welcome and a framing of the event tonight. So what I will really do before giving the word to Candace Goodrich and Fabrizio Balsov, who will do the proper introduction of tonight's guest, is just really to welcome you to the keynote lecture series. We are very happy to open this year's or this semester's series with the keynote lecture by Professor Timo Maran, who is joining us also online from the University of Tartu in Estonia, and who will be talking tonight on ecosemiotics of the Anthropocene, how to reground culture in ecosystems. There will be kind of a double feature on Anthropocene-related topics. So the next keynote lecture coming up this year before the break will also address questions of Anthropocene with Florian Musknuk from UC London and his lecture on transhistorical speculative fiction and the post-apocalyptic Anthropocene. Before we will then, after the break, after the winter break, continue with 3 more keynote lectures. The first after the break by Vitaly Chernetsky from the University of Kansas on utopia and queer futurity related to Ukraine. And then we will have Johannes Angermüller from the Open University UK, who will talk about truth as a discursive positioning game, hyper-visible subjects in political and academic discourse. The lecture series will then be closed in February by Sarita Monjane Henriksen, who is currently also staying here at Justus Liebig University. This is a cooperation here between the GCSC and RCSC and the chair here at JLU for cultural sociology. So she will talk about the power of mainstream Western media in influencing discourses on migration, defying the narrative. Just to give you a rough idea of the roadmap that's kind of on or that's guiding us through the semester, I'm now happy, as I said, to hand over to Candace Goodrich as a speaker of RA9, and a big thank you also to the two of you, but also to the whole research area, of course, for organizing the event, for also inviting our esteemed guest tonight, Professor Maran, and I hand over to Candace. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Basseler. So first of all, this is a collaboration between Research Area 9, which is the study of ecology, as well as emerging topics, interfaces in the study of culture and life sciences. Speaker Fabian Pindus, and I want to thank also my co-speaker Fabrizio Balsov, and all of our members for so much hard work on bringing this event into fruition, which is actually the first of 2 events. So we have the keynote lecture tonight. And Professor Timo Maran is joining us, I guess, from Tartu today, I hope. And then tomorrow he will be conducting a master class so we can also more deeply engage in the topics that we'll hear about tonight, you are welcome to join. That will be at 2 o'clock tomorrow. It's a 2-hour masterclass, and it is also hybrid, so you can join online if you're not able to in person. That'll be in seminar room 109, and the same link that we have used today. So now to Professor Maran. It is with great pleasure that I introduce him, and I'm so pleased that he accepted our invitation to join us for these two events at the beginning of our winter semester. Professor Maran is a professor of ecosemiotics and environmental humanities. One could say he's one of the founding scholars on the subdiscipline of ecosemiotics. He is currently the editor of Sign System Studies, one of the oldest semiotic journals dedicated to semiotics, as well as co-editor-in-chief of Biosemiotics. He's the editor of a Cambridge University Press series called Elements in Environmental Humanities, and himself has published a book in 2020 entitled Ecosemiotics, the Study of Signs in Changing Ecologies, which I encourage you to read. It's really excellent. He publishes widely both academic texts as well as poetry in a number of important journals, academic journals, and anthologies, which would include the companion to Yuri Lotman, A Semiotic Theory of Culture, which was published in 2022 for the centenary of Yuri Lotman's life and contribution to semiotics in life sciences. It is with great pleasure that I welcome him here today, and I will give him the floor now. Thank you.
So, greetings from Tartu, or from Torpat, as it was in older German name. I'm really glad to be with you here, either not in person, but from a distance. I tried to minimize my environmental footprint and do not travel so often. But nevertheless, I hope that we can have an interesting evening and some reflections and feedback from your side. I would be very much. So I think the fact that I was invited probably has to do something with this recent book, Ecosemiotics, the study of science in changing ecologies, that was published a few years ago by Cambridge University Press. So I start with that, introduce shortly ecosemiotic paradigm, and thereafter continue to talk about how my thinking and ideas have developed further from this book. So yes, the basic idea with this volume was to give a kind of popular introduction to ecosemiotics and to open up its relevance for environmental humanities. And the book itself makes a kind of three interconnected arguments. So basically I tried to do like three things. First, to show the diversity, reach, and effects of sign-mediated or semiotic relations in natural environment, in different ecosystems, starting from the level of individual animal living in its own world, up to the functioning of biological communities and ecosystems. And secondly, connected with that, I try to show that in fact in human culture and in human communication, we are also often using this kind of pre-linguistic or pre-cultural semiotic relations or sign relations that can be used and that we are using, in fact, to make contact with other species and with ecosystems. And as a part of that second argument, also I developed a kind of critical view towards symbol-dominated culture, or kind of self-contained culture that, because of its reliance on symbol systems, are not able to connect with the ecosystem anymore, and the detrimental effects that this can bring along. And the third part of the book was to show that using models and modeling, using semiotic tools, we can describe and map relations between texts and natural environment, or also the lack of these, and that we can analyze semiotically semiotic relations that connect culture with the environment. But what is very important, using these modeling devices also to initiate and to create artistically new, environmentally more friendly cultural forms and practices. So in a sense, I think this book conveys a central message of ecosemiotic paradigm, that human culture and communication is not separate from biological communication and biosemiosis, but that we can see these two domains as interconnected by different types of science, communication, and semiotic processes. So basically, we can think here human culture not as a kind of island in a void, but rather as being surrounded with semiotic and sign activities of our species and sign potentials of the environment. And this approach has been kind of motivated and supported also by my own academic career. So actually, I started as an animal ecologist. My first bachelor degree is in animal ecology, and then there, being in biological department of Tartu University, I studied communication between different species, different biological groups, and more especially biological mimicry, which is kind of deceiving similarities between different organisms, either in sound or in color or in chemical signals and so forth. But being then interested in communication between different species and also between humans and animals, I turned more towards semiosis and semiotics and cultural theory. And so actually wrote my PhD already in the Department of Semiotics, focusing then more and more to kind of interconnection between cultural processes and ecological processes. And in addition to that, I'm also a creative writer. I have been published 5 collections of poetry, mostly also dealing with nature, representations of nature, and interconnections between humans, human fate, and the environment. So, in a way, my personal academic journey has been pretty much related with representations of nature and the question how to find ways of putting together and synthesizing human culture and biological processes and sign processes. Now, academically, most of my work is in the field of ecosemiotics that can be understood as a study of sign processes in ecosystems between various living beings and the environment, and between human culture and nature. So on one hand, yes, ecosemiotics deals with semiotic potential of environment and different species living each in its own umwelt, and how they make sense through these personal life worlds about the surrounding broader environment. But at the same time, ecosemiotics also includes semiotic potential of physical material environment, what sort of affordances or kind of iconic sign potentials the environment has, and how this can be picked up and used in various communicative processes and representations. And also, on the other hand, ecosemiotics includes human cultural representations, human cultural texts, up to very symbolic and already fixed habit-based ways how we relate with the surrounding environment. So the question of symbolic animals, for instance, or animal symbols, how they are used in let's say, as symbols of certain environmental movements or national symbols. This also can be interest of ecosemiotics, insofar as these highly symbolic processes relate back and can influence the habitats and living quality of these very species. So if you look at practical applications, then ecosemiotics has been used in the study of very broad range of objects, nature writing, ecocinema, urban trees, urban vegetations, also alien species or invasive species, medicine plants, and other such objects. And I think ecosemiotics is especially effective in cases where different kind of layers of sign processes, some that have to do with the biological processes and biological realities themselves, and others that have to do with human cultural processes and signification processes, where these interact and also create different kind of hybrid phenomena. And from this perspective, or from this ground, ecosemiotics also deals with the semiotic aspects of environmental problems. This is the dynamics and conflicts in semiotic processes in ecosystems, different situations where, let's say, different species, their relations are conflictive in ecosystems, or also because of some large-scale change in environmental processes. For instance, the ways how other species interpret their environment becomes tackled or becomes problematic. So this kind of shifts in interpretation patterns, which often have to do with human anthropogenic effects, this also may interest ecosemiotics. As a discipline or as a paradigm, ecosemiotics started in early 1990s, and much of its development has to do with the Tartu semiotic schools and academic activities that we have done here in Tartu. It needs to be mentioned also that the different authors who have been connected with ecosemiotics have had a bit different focus. So there are some authors, like very renowned German semiotician Winfried Neuf, who has defined ecosemiotics as a study of sign processes which relate organisms to the natural environment. And so here the attention is more put towards the animal organisms relating with their usually inanimate environment, material environment, and how meaning arises from these interactions. There are some other views, as for instance, Kalevi Kull, our professor in biosemiotics, has considered ecosemiotics as a study of sign processes which where human culture has a semiotic or sign-mediated basis. So here, basically, ecosemiotics is related with cultural semiotics. It is seen as a part of cultural semiotics that deals with different ways how nature and environment becomes meaningful in culture. It is close to also anthropology and has this kind of comparative perspective. So how and in what ways different cultures make meaning and distinguish, use different categorizations, for instance. What may be interesting to you is that a lot of ecosemiotics actually has also kind of a German language, German intellectual tradition relation. I mentioned Winfried Neuf, who has been really one of grounding figures of ecosemiotic movements, but there are other names to mention as well. There is Martin Krampen, an architecture semiotician from Berlin, who wrote about semiotics of urban spaces, including this kind of environmental and ecological topics. And later, he also developed his own approach of plant semiotics or phytosemiotics, very interesting direction of thought. Then there is Ernst Hess-Lüttich from the University of Bern in Switzerland, originally also from Berlin. And he has developed literary theory and a kind of approaches to space, the depictions of space in literature, which also relates to ecosemiotic and tradition. And then there is, of course, Jakob von Uexküll, his Umwelt theory, a Baltic German biologist and a forerunner of biosemiotics, and ecosemiotics pretty much uses this kind of Umwelt approach, seeing each and every animal species as living in its own individual perceptual world. Now, as you all know, today we are living in the times of ecological crisis, and the second part of my lecture has to do with a semiotic criticism of Anthropocene. Ecological crisis has many phases and many problems: the degradation of natural ecosystems, human-induced climate change, global biodiversity loss, the spread of invasive species, the accumulation of waste, the depletion of resources, and all the interconnected effects and outcomes of these issues. And ecological damage as such is often connected with so-called great acceleration or the rapid growth of many social measurements like population growth, gross-national product, energy usage, and others from mid-20th century onwards. This global impact of humans is deeply rooted in our growth-oriented economies and societies and can be generally described as overexploitation of nature's resources for the sake of human-oriented short-term advantages that comes at the expense of our biological species. In this context, it is a responsibility of semiotics and ecosemiotics especially to develop tools and methodologies to address the challenges of ecological crisis. So this would lead to some very essential questions for contemporary semiotics: how human meaning-making systems can adapt for new ecological realities, how semiotics can provide means for a society to become less polluting and more sustainable, and also what are the semiotic grounds and the reasons why this kind of issues have emerged. So what has went wrong in our human usage of communication and science? From a semiotic perspective, the Anthropocene is manifested as a multiplication and spread of abstract symbolic signs and information content. So in addition to acceleration process in social and Anthropocene means, we can also talk about semiotic acceleration as a speeding up of all communication and meaning processes. And this has to do with the symbols and discourses becoming more and more separate to their object domains or from their reference, and forming this kind of semiotic bubbles that instigate hastily and superficial interpretation. This process was foreseen and is probably best described by Jean Baudrillard under the concept of simulacrum. And although this source is quite old already, I still would like to cite Baudrillard here. So he describes simulacrum as a process where liquidation of all referentials take place. In a simulacrum, no representation or reference remains, as there is no truth, reference, objective cause, and the whole system becomes weightless in certain sense. So the process that appears to be specific to Anthropocene semiosis is the degradation of the object or the referential dimension of sign processes. This tendency is actually observed by several people working in semiotics. So for instance, Swedish anthropologist and semiotician Alf Hornborg has shown that the abstracted symbolic signs, which he calls economic signs, have devastating effects to local traditional cultures. And his object of study were traditional cultures of Amerindian nations. And he shows how we can distinguish between different layers of abstractness or generality of sign processes that we are using. So there are tacit signs or sensory signs which are very close to actual contact with different plants and animals and weather conditions. Then there are linguistic signs which are already in the level of linguistic reference, and in this level specific names, specific linguistic pointers or indicators are used to make reference to different species or environmental objects. And in addition, we have kind of abstracted economical science, and each and every subsequent level kind of presumes the previous one, but at the same time detaches and overrides the previous one. So the linguistic science, in some sense, cover the sensory science, and economical science detach and dissemblage the linguistic science. Tyler Bennett, another semiotician, has shown that this kind of over-generalized symbolic signs tend to lose their object dimension and degrade from triadic signs to dyadic forms that he calls means. So basically, in this process, symbols become too self-contained. They turn into memes and lose their capacity to represent. This whole direction of criticism is based on the semiotic theory of American pragmatist philosopher and semiotician Charles Peirce, who worked out this kind of tripartite model of sign that includes object, representant, and interpretant. And he also proposes the triad or trichotomy of signs, dividing these between icons, indexes, and symbols. And in case of icons and indexes, there are a physical or causal connection with the object in the environment, either by the similarity or by associations. But symbols, on the other hand, these are conventional and arbitrary signs of culture, being based on cultural habits, cultural tradition, or also convention. So here are some examples that can be considered as visual icons, indexes, and symbols. So the picture, any picture, is an icon to a large degree. We can consider animal footprints as indexes because there is this kind of causal physical connection between an animal that has left these signs and between these footprints. And then there is a symbolic representation that has to do with social conventions and habit, but where this kind of immediate or causal relationship already has pretty much decayed, or that is in the background. It's not active, it's not dominant anymore. So many biosemiotics have taken the view that symbols and symbolic reference is something that is specific to our species. Animals sometimes, some species may also use this kind of sign communication, but predominantly other species are using iconic and indexical signs. We humans, we are using all the three. And now a problem with ecological or environmental issues becomes if we are too much relying on this kind of symbol systems when our symbolic representations and generalizations become detached from this environmental semiosis. And here, David Lowe, Australian semiotician and communication scholar, has proposed the concept of dissent as a way to describe and characterize this kind of split that happens between environmental processes having their semiotic potential and human discourses about the environment. Symbolic signs make human culture dangerous for ecosystems, because in simpler sign processes, in iconic and indexical signs, there is some sort of grounding and there is some sort of feedback. So if something happens in the object level, in the physical or material environment, in ecological flows of matter and energy, then iconic and indexical signs are changing as a kind of response or in relation with that. Whereas human symbolic signs, being conventional, do not have this type of feedback cycles. And this may cause a situation where discourses, artifacts, and text in culture can be repeated and reproduced to fill all the available media and to use up all the available resources. And probably if we think about the overwhelming spread of memes or tropes in social media, and also accelerating replacement of commodities with newer and newer goods, then this can be seen as an outcome of this kind of symbolic dominance. There's no any sort of good negative feedback that would connect this kind of symbolic processes with ecological processes. At the same time, symbolic signs are related with the physical world due to the matter and energy required to produce and upkeep various media and artifacts that embody signs. Internet communication needs servers, cables, and computers. Producing media content needs cameras, microphones, and special equipment. Symbols of social status are embodied in clothes, accessories, vehicles, and buildings, and so forth. So signs are embodied in our communication technologies, consumer goods, infrastructure, and cultural artifacts that all require matter and energy, and in some point become obsolete and disregarded as waste. So the extensive energy usage and consumption seems to be directly related to how human culture and semiotics have developed in the 20th century, and the very fact that we are so much relying on the kind of self-contained and discrete symbol systems. There is a possible alternative view that have been developed by anthropologists Eduardo Kohn and Andrew Whitehouse, who have proposed the concept of semiotic ground to denote the semiotic basis of traditional cultures living in ecosystems. It may be claimed that there is a kind of iconic and indexical sign complex or sign tissue that constitutes a common semiotic ground for humans and non-human species alike, and that is also connected to the patterns of the material realm. So physical objects can actualize to organisms in the form of environmental constraints, properties of the environment, and resources. And in many cases, we know that organisms search for specific objects, recognize the qualities of trees, how they can, for instance, provide physical support or protection, what sort of nutritional value or accessibility they have, which have to do pretty much with this kind of iconic and indexical signs. So anthropologist Eduardo Kohn, working with languages and cultures of Amerindian nations, notes that icons and indexes create modalities shared by different animal species. He wrote, living dynamics is constitutively semiotic. The semiosis of life is iconic and indexical. Symbolic reference, which makes humans unique, is an emergent dynamic that is nested within this broader semiosis of life, from which it stems and on which it depends. And the British or Scottish anthropologist Andrew Whitehouse has developed this view by Eduardo Kohn further, and he's using the concept of meshwork to support the same argument. So he claims that this iconic indexical framework may be thought as of meshwork, way of thinking about the world as emergent, fluid, and entangled, that chimes with both Kohn's and Peirce's ontological claims. The lines, knots, and texture of meshwork are themselves semiotic. Iconic forms are continually emerging in the continuous rebirth of the world. Materialized indexical associations are what things are made of. The meshwork is semiosis made flesh. So basically, we can think about this semiotic ground as a texture or fabric of iconic and indexical sign relation used across species, and we humans, we also quite often rely and use these semiotic modalities because in addition of being cultural and literate beings, we also biological beings. We are bodily beings. So both Eduardo Kohn and Andrew Whitehouse connect semiotic ground with the lived experience and the process of living with kind of here and now impressions, events, encounters, and experiences. So we may imagine the semiotic ground as a kind of fabric of similarities and associations by which different species connect to one another and to the potentials and affordances of the land. Semiotic ground is language-like in the sense that it provides possibilities for interspecies communication and supports the coherence of the ecosystem. But at the same time, it's much more heterogenic and ambivalent compared to any human language. So let us think for a second what the semiotic ground could include in a natural ecosystem. And I hope that you excuse my bit poetical expression here, but we can consider a semiotic ground as including geographical relief and rules of movement, open and closed views, hideouts and shelters, obstacles, water bodies for drinking, flows of winds and directions of flyways, landmarks and other navigation aids, recognition of species mates, enemies, partners and offspring, cycles of weather and circadian rhythms, morning choir of birds with its rhythms and pauses, the rain that erases smells and odors, different pitches of sounds interpreted differently due to physical obstacles, light, a lot of light in different variations and hues, patterns of colors and shapes, fragmentations of landscape, rapid alarm calls of various bird species that indicate danger, and so on. So it's just to give you some impression what this semiotic ground can include. And upon this kind of fabric or tissue of this iconic and indexical references, more complex and more species-specific communication systems can be built either our human ones or the ones that other species are using that have to do with rituals and this type of more kind of perhaps symbolic or already ritualized specific habits of courtship behavior or other this type of communications. This view of semiotic ground very interestingly comes together and fits well with some ideas that have been put forward in ecosemiotics and ecology that has to do with ecosystems and functioning of ecosystems. So namely, in ecosystem ecology, there is an idea that informational and communicational processes in ecosystems are a very important factor that regulates and stabilizes ecosystems. It comes from system ecologist Bernard Button and Eugene Audon, who have described the kind of informational layer or communicative layer in ecosystems that consists an enormous number of local kind of connections or local feedback cycles. And in their view, this is the main reason why ecosystems retain their stable structure and do not disperse into myriads of chaotic events. So Patton and Audon further described informational processes in more detailed way that allow this kind of connectivity to emerge between different entities and layers of ecosystems. And some of this language that they are using becomes quite close to semiotics. So they are talking about mapping and amplification, for instance. And one of these co-authors, Bernard Button, has later developed this view further and basically has argued that also ecosystems outside of human culture, they have some sort of capacity of modeling themselves, or they have through these informational and communication layers an ability to memorize themselves, their structure, their functioning in a certain way. So when I quote Bernard Button, he's talking about ecosystems as model-making complex adaptive systems, and he's suggesting basically that ecosystem includes a dispersed and fragmented meta layer that is able to keep up the memory of ecosystem structure and functioning. And I find this idea very interesting, especially in relation to semiotic ground, because it basically puts us to the situation where, in addition to human culture that has its memory mechanisms, there is also an ecosystem that has its memory mechanism and its kind of self-description and auto-communication, much more dispersed and of different kind, but still there's an interesting question that how these two now become to interact with one another. So in what ways human culture and human communication is in relation with this semiotic ground or ecosystems as memory mechanisms. And from here on, what are our possibilities of restoring this connectedness if it has been disappeared from some reason? And there are probably different methodological ways to work with that. I have used some help from Yuri Lotman, a Russian semiotician and literary scholar, and his concept of semiosphere. And why I find semiosphere concept interesting here is that the semiosphere concept is very dynamical, and it has this kind of theoretical complexity. It stresses the irregularities, asymmetries, also heterogeneity that we have, like many different languages. We have constant dialogues going on in a semiosphere as a kind of cultural whole that includes all texts, all cultural artifacts, all cultural processes. This, in principle, is a definition of semiosphere. But this very way how Lotman uses this concept that puts a lot of emphasis to this kind of heterogeneity and asymmetries, and also kind of boundaries and borders, which at the same time are just the places where different translation processes, different decoding and changes take place. So I think that this approach is very fruitful also to use for discussing the ways how human culture can be embedded into ecosystems. So we can talk perhaps about ecosemiosphere as a semiotic system that comprises all species and their umwelts alongside the diverse semiotic relations that they have in the given ecosystem, which also includes humans and our culture, and also material support structures are important because they enable this ecosystem or ecosemiosphere to thrive in the same way how we humans, in fact, need this biosemiotic or ecosemiotic processes to support our cultural creation and human culture. So we can use this ecosemiosphere concept as a kind of a formal model with kind of hierarchical structure, hierarchical complexity. So we have resources and surfaces in the physical environment and different affordances, different usability, different functionality of these. We have then semiotic ground or various types of indexical and iconic sign relations, both non-human species and humans. And then we have human cultural symbolic semiosis and communication. So why to distinguish between these? Probably the good reason is that these different complexity layers, they behave or function differently in the ecosemiosphere. So semiotic ground is very much here and now related to material and energetic flows and processes, whereas human cultural symbolic semiosis can be easily detached and transported from one culture to another. There can be cultural loans, often human symbolic texts. They also have their own kind of durability or their own life, in the sense that they can easily endure over the centuries and still influence the way how we humans interact with the environment. So in these different layers, we can distinguish and describe different activity centers that can be seen as related between different types of semiotic processes. There are perceptual affordance, there are translation processes or biotranslation as relations between different umwelts. There is a environmental dissent that I mentioned earlier. There is a process of semiocide and semiotic pollution as a kind of detrimental semiotic processes where one agent in the system somehow makes the activities of our agents problematic or somehow suppresses these and so forth. Now we can ask, is there any kind of practical guidelines or kind of practical means how to move toward greater inclusion or greater connection between human culture and this semiotic ground in ecosemiosphere model? And I think a few suggestions can be made or can be given. First, I think what we need some critical attention and awareness towards semiotic systems that would allow us to move towards more integrated and rooted semiotic practices. So how semiotic processes function in general and how they influence human subjects. So this relates to this semiotic criticism of Anthropocene, with which I started, to understand how we are kind of entrapped into these symbolic generalizations. We need some understanding of how semiotic processes function. And to give here some parallel, I think in early 1990s, there was a strong bio-regionalist movement coming from United States and also spreading in other parts of the globe that encouraged people to learn the ecology of their local communities by getting to know the cycles of resources, food, water, waste, and so forth. And similarly, perhaps we can use semiotics to understand the movement of information and cultural influences in the local ecocultures. So from where different signifying practices originate, what signs conceal, what they substitute, or what they dislodge, because this is also often a kind of quality of semiotic processes that they conceal some other processes. So how interpretation is taking place? Is it shallow? Is it through-going? How much kind of depth this interpretation acts have? And this kind of basic fluency in semiotics would help to understand the workings of abstract symbol systems and interpret science in a broader cultural ecological context. Now, the second step would be opening up and integrating across semiotic layers. As I mentioned before, a characteristic feature of Anthropocene semiotics is a dominance of symbol systems and the formation of this kind of closed semiotic bubbles, and also the fact that the different semiotic layers, which have different complexities, become disconnected from one another. So basically, the suggestion is that if we open up a semiotic spaces, we foster integration between different semiotic layers and reground symbols and this is beneficial and supports transition towards more ecological culture. And we may have actually a lot of semiotic capacities that we have in hand, because we humans, we also using icons and indexes, we are using non-verbal semiosis, we can use pre-verbal kind of tactile and emphatic communication to make relations with other species. We can vertically create connections between human symbolic representations and environmental signs, enrich our cultural practices with some rhythms and structures that landscapes provide, add more environmental context, contextual information to our interpretation, and so forth. So being aware and acknowledging this that we are doing in communication process to make more this kind of vertical integration between different layers of the ecosemiosphere. And the third point would be the idea that we would need the relinquish control, to give up control and relying more on dialogical interpretation. Because it seems that the formation of closed symbolic sign systems goes hand in hand with the human ambition to control our communication and interpretation, to keep it in our hands. And in contrast, this kind of habitual semiotic routines can be changed by lessening this control and by making interpretation also open for other subjects, both human and non-human. And here I have got some influence from German sociologist Hartmut Rose, who I think has done very good and important work in thinking through these human controlled cultural processes in relation with Anthropocene. From semiotic perspective, I can see that there are two practical ways to nurture dialogic relations in more ecological cultures. Firstly, by learning codes, signs, and languages used by other subjects, both human and non-human. And secondly, by providing meanings and significance for other subjects through the activities and behaviors that are potentially meaningful for them. So if to turn back to works of Jakob von Uexküll and his meaning cycle or functional cycle, then this included like two wholes or two parts. First was about perception and other was about action or activity. And I think both of these can be usable or important here. On one hand, we can get more information for interpreting the surrounding environment and other living beings that share this environment with us. But on the other hand, we also can act and be active in the world in the way that our activities are accessible and become more meaningful for other living beings and other species who share the same environment with us. So now I'm reaching to the conclusions, and let us here move backwards from the ecosemiosphere model towards this problematic issues towards this split between cultural symbolic systems and semiotic ground, my main argument today, I think, is that this iconic indexical base or semiotic ground, this semiotic fabric, seems to have a central importance when we think about, or when we try to work towards integrating human culture and ecosystems. On one hand, it connects semiotic activities of different organisms, their communication, their behavior relations, but it also includes and corresponds to material patterns and rhythms. And it also may give an important input to human culture, human cultural text, and human cultural activities. And this has been brought forward to some other scholars working in the field. For instance, Dominique Lestel, French philosopher and ethologist, have pointed out this, how important the semiotic activities of our species is for human cultural inspiration. So how much we actually kind of learn and get from other species by looking, by listening their different communicative expressions, and how this may really be an important source for enriching human cultural processes, human culture as such. And in fact, yes, this iconic and indexical sign processes, they also present in human communication, in human cultural text, as I have shown in my book on ecosemiotics more. So for an ecosemiosphere model, the question of dialogic interrelations between semiotic ground and symbol-based human culture seem to have a central significance. And as I tried to indicate, there are some practical ways and methods how this connection can be fostered, how it can be restored, and to develop towards more strong and resilient ecological cultures. I think we need to have this kind of dialogic relations and integration between these different layers. We need to move towards a direction where human cultures accept this iconic indexical ground as a kind of second science system or second language that is essential for human culture's own survival and well-being. So I think that ecosemiotics can be helpful in this process and in this dialogue by providing some conceptual grounds and methods to analyze relations between human culture and semiotic activities taking place in ecosystems and between different other life forms. Of course, ecosemiotics is just one tiny paradigm among environmental humanities. So this effort needs to be collective, it needs to be dialogical. Environmental problems are just too large and too complex for any paradigm, any discipline being able to solve them by itself. So this was my lecture today, and now I'm open to your views and questions.